Okay, Phyllis, right before the break, you were very much in disagreement with Cynthia. We were talking about the usefulness of violence committed by the United States against Syria. Go ahead.
Well, I think there's 2 points. One is that what the president has proposed is a small, surgical, limited, how many adjectives can we come up with to say it's going to be a really tiny military strike, which is not designed to take out any capacity, will kill people, according to the Pentagon, because they admit that the cruise missiles are not very controllable in terms of hitting their target. So what are we really talking about here? We're talking about killing people to punish their government for using an illegal weapon. The point is not, when we talk about the leadership of the United States, I think that Cynthia is right that U.S. leadership has been defined solely as military in recent years, and right now we're seeing a huge crisis of the militarization of U.S. foreign policy, the militarization of diplomacy. What we need is a return to real diplomacy, forceful diplomacy, that includes, for example, an arms embargo on all sides in Syria, so that we get the Russians to stop sending arms to the regime and get the Iranians to do the same thing, while we get our partners in Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Jordan and Turkey to stop arming the other side. Without that kind of an arms embargo,
but that sounds like a great idea, but how could we ever get anyone to do that?
To the table.
Cynthia, go ahead. I don't think the Saudis won't cooperate. That's for sure. If we will no longer send weapons to the Saudis, we tell the Saudis we're not going to send them any more weapons and we're not going to send them any more spare parts. We start telling Boeing that we're going to treat them the way the Agriculture Department treats farmers. Pay them not to produce weapons. Pay them to retool their factory to build solar panels instead of military equipment. Okay.
We'd go a lot farther.
Let me go to Jason here.
Well, I think it's a great idea.
Let me go to Jason here. Let's go to Jason.
Never do that.
Jason, that sounds like a great idea, but it's never going to happen. There's no political will for that. Absolutely. After the last 10 years?
Well, I think we are in a great position. We're in a great position to bring both the rebels and Assad to the table. The last thing Assad wants is a full-scale military intervention. The last thing the rebels want is a denial of U.S. support. If we take our support away, the rebel movement, I think, will collapse, and Assad will roll right over it and reinstall his power. But I think we're in a position to bring them to the table. But as you say, it's never going to happen, because I think what we're executing is that old Donald Rumsfeld plan of 7 nations in 5 years. Really, we're you know, the schedule's a little bit off. We're going a little slowly, but we are, I think, ultimately trying to isolate Iran here and getting rid of the Assad regime, which is an Iranian ally, potentially then Hezbollah in Lebanon, would totally isolate Iran and would allow us to clear the field for a buildup of an attack against Iran's nuclear power capabilities.
Phyllis, does that make the possibility of an attack on Syria even greater in your mind? You just heard the scenario.
Middle Eastern oil and gas.
You just heard the scenario from Jason.
That is.
Go ahead, pick up on it, Phyllis. Go ahead.
It does make the possibility even greater. This is partly because Israel has only recently come into the equation supporting a strike against Syria, which they had not been supporting earlier, largely because the regime of both Hafez al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad, despite all the rhetoric about resistance and this and that, have actually been very useful to Israel, kept the occupied Golan Heights quiet, kept the border secure, kept the Palestinians in Syria under very tight control. So this has been a very useful regime for Israel as a neighbor. And only now, when there is this threat because of the language of so-called red lines, that Israel has weighed in saying you can't not respond militarily to a red line being crossed in Syria, because if you do, Iran will get the idea that a red line can be crossed on their side and we won't respond militarily. The problem is, again, it comes back to what's going to happen the day after. Syria or Iran have enormous possibilities for retaliation against the United States, against Israel, against U.S. allies in the region. And there's no talk in Washington about what comes next. We can talk all we want about this being a small-scale, limited war, a limited attack. But when and if Syria or Iran or somebody else retaliates the next day, then what happens? That's when you start hearing about larger-scale intervention and boots on the ground.
Cynthia, do you want to react to that?
I seriously doubt anything about boots on the ground. And it's absolutely correct that Syria is a quagmire, and we're not going to try to solve it with whatever action we take. But what is unfortunate is, I'd like to come back to the situation in the United States. What is unfortunate is that President Obama has lost, I think, the advantage he had of acting quickly, an action which had to be followed and accompanied, indeed, by strong diplomatic pressure, and we wouldn't have acted alone. France was willing to act with us, and Turkey. Now, by taking this much time and not even calling the Congress back, I think the chances of Congress supporting this are slim. I can guarantee that when they're, and you've already said 9% among the American public, when they're out talking in the public, there's not going to be support of this. This is a case which really requires international leadership, and yes, also strong international diplomacy. And President Obama is trying to have it all ways, trying to please everyone. And by losing time, he gives Assad plenty of time to prepare for whatever is coming, as well as Iran. And so I fear he may have lost whatever advantage, whatever strength may have come from this had he acted earlier.
Jason, what do you think of that?
It gives us time to fight against the possibility of militarization.
Go ahead, Jason.
You have maps in USA Today showing the different places where strikes will be conducted. It's on all the talk shows. Everyone's talking about it. So it's certainly not a surprise to anyone. And Syria, I'm sure, has been doing their best to prepare for it. I think that President Obama, if he doesn't get, he was on the television this morning saying that Syria represented a direct national security threat to the United States.
How is that possible? How is that possible? It's absurd.
It's not possible. It's a ridiculous claim, but he's making his case to Congress. And when you make statements like that, I think even if Congress says no, he will use NATO. He will go with NATO and go in, really sadly to save face and not be characterized as.
I'm glad you bring up saving face. I'm glad you're bringing up saving face, Phyllis. Obama, this is his dilemma: saving face, his credibility.
That's a lot of what's at stake here.
Go ahead. That's it. It's credibility.
The credibility has been miscreated. The credibility factor about this so-called red line is the problem, and that's what we're looking at. With the excuse that chemical weapons are a violation of international law is absolutely right, and I wish that the U.S. had taken that position before it, for example, sent targeting satellite material to Iraq to use chemical weapons against Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. I wish they had used it to prevent the small outfit here outside of Washington that sent the biological weapon seed stock to Saddam Hussein's government. I wish the U.S. then had said, this is illegal, we can't be part of it. To say it now has a bit of hypocrisy there. It should be responded to. There should be accountability
better
for
late
anyone
than never.
who uses these weapons.
Better to
that accountability does not come from, it doesn't come militarily. Nothing in international law allows the use of military force by one country to punish the government of another country for a violation. It was not aimed at us. This is not self-defense. It is not our interests that are at stake here. It's the people of Syria. And if we want to be serious about defending their rights, the first thing we can do is not send missiles against them.
Okay, Cynthia, would you like to reply to that?
Well, we have done this before, as in the case of Kosovo, and have done it effectively. So there is precedent for this.
Kosovo was illegal.
And a lot of people were killed. A lot of civilians were killed on top of it as well.
We nonetheless did it and prevented a genocide. So I mean, there's not a whole lot of point in arguing about it now. There is precedent for it. As long as international law is requiring the UN to okay things, and the UN will never okay anything, it becomes, a hopeless case. But I do think in this case, President Obama has really cut himself off at the knees.
Okay, what happened to international law here?
I mean, ask the people of Kosovo.
Jason.
Ask the people of Kosovo if it worked.
Well, I mean, there was a slaughter. Go ahead, Jason. Jump in. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jason. After the NATO
international law is being, disregarded here. I mean, the Supreme, as Justice Robert Jackson said, he was our chief counsel at the Nuremberg trial of the Nazi war criminals. he said the supreme international crime, and this has been kind of the de facto legal opinion since, the supreme international crime is a war of aggression because it contains within it the accumulated evil of everything that comes after it. And I think that's what we're facing here is a war of aggression, and we haven't even begun to address the fallout of that, and the blowback of that war of aggression. And we've seen in Libya, it's ruled by militias now. We overthrew the regime there, but now it's ruled by militias. Iraq is a frayed nation threatening to split into 3 partitions. Afghanistan is a failed state. The NATO general just said yesterday they may need 5 more years of NATO and U.S. support before their armed forces in Afghanistan can stand on their own. I mean, we're destabilizing countries all around the Middle East, and you have to wonder if that's
okay, I'm going to give Cynthia the last word. To be fair, go ahead, Cynthia, go ahead.
I am in violent agreement with you about the problems of the militarization of U.S. foreign policy. You only have to look at Egypt for that. You know, that's all we do is deal with the military, and they don't even listen to us. It's a complete and total failure. I agree with you on that. I do, however, think in the case of this humanitarian catastrophe and gross violation of international law, human rights, and every standard you can think of, that there needs to be a vigorous response from the United States, and I think there has to be some kind of targeted military response accompanied by using that as pressure to get the sides to the bargaining table. I don't see what people think.
All right, folks, we've run out of time. I hope all parties involved will push for diplomacy. Many thanks today to my guests in Washington and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, Crosstalk rules.